Hello viewers, welcome to these lessons on the judicial system in India. In today's class, we will be looking at the judicial system in India during ancient times and a pre-constitutional era. The judicial system in India was well developed before the advent of colonialism and the establishment of modern judicial systems. However, the present judicial system is largely based on imperial charters and colonial legislations. The pre-British era saw many overlapping legal systems such as Hindu and Muslim law from the Dharmashastras and Sharia law, along with custom and local usage, which were invoked in a variety of circumstances. The colonial state uprooted many of these systems and imposed a system largely based on English law. The present high courts and supreme courts were established by the British, and most of the law in force is law drafted during the British era. It is useful to examine the antecedents of the present judicial and legal system to appreciate their role and function. The objectives of this lesson are to examine the ancient judicial system in India before colonialism, to examine the changes that were brought about in the ancient judicial system by the East India Company, to examine the changes brought about post the proclamation of India as a British colony, to understand the role and function of the institutions such as the High Courts and the Supreme Court. The present Indian legal system, including the Constitution, is not written on a clean slate, but has several aspects of the colonial law and the earlier Hindu and Muslim legal systems. The judicial system in India was well developed before the advent of colonialism and the establishment of modern judicial systems. However, the present judicial system is largely based on the imperial charters and colonial legislations. K. Hanumantayya summed up the mood in the Constituent Assembly as he regretfully said, "We wanted the music of veena or sitar, but we have the music of an English band." Rohit Day states that modern constitutionalism in India began with the written text of the Charter of 1600 granted by Queen Elizabeth, which delegated both legislative and judicial powers to the government appointed by the English East India Company for the better advancement and continuance of trade. Hence, a study of the ancient judicial system and the pre-constitutional judicial system is very relevant to understand the modern judicial system. For the purpose of this lesson, we will divide the judicial system of an ancient time and pre-constitutional era into three periods: a pre-British era, the British era, that is from 1600 to 1758, and from 1758 to 1950, British India under the Independence Act. The pre-British era. Mark Gallanter observes that the pre-British era saw many overlapping legal systems such as Hindu and Muslim law from the Dharmashastras and the Sharia law, which were being invoked in a variety of circumstances. These were not formal sources of law such as religious texts only, but a variety of customs and practices were also acknowledged and were a part of the law. Hindu law has been used to refer to a wide variety of beliefs and practices, and the word Hindu was used to refer to persons from an area rather than belonging to a Hindu faith. Hindu law came to be distinguished from Muslim law only from the 19th century onwards under the advent of the British, who distinguished between the Hindu and the Muslim. Hindu law, as it was applied in the pre-British India, was a combination of custom, religion and interpretation. It was not extremely textual and varied from region to region. In fact, one of the projects of the British was to bring all of this law into a code or a text, and the supremacy of the text to the interpretation is attributed to the British positivism. Hindu law can be divided into three kinds: classical Hindu law during the British, and the modern Hindu law. The three types also correspond to the three periods of pre-British, British and modern law. The concepts in classic Hindu law such as dharma were not confined to religious duties, but were broader than that to include legal duties and a wide range of human activities. Dharma includes law as well as justice and cannot be confined to religious duties. The sources of dharma were the Vedas, the Smriti or the heard text such as the Dharma Shastras, and also Achara or practice, that is custom, which varied from place to place and group to group. To date, there is no clear definition of what religion is and its sources. The Dharma Shastras contained daily rituals, life cycle rituals and Vyavahara, that is laws and legal procedures. These included duties of the kings, the manner of evidence and witness examination, as well as methods to enforce justice and punishment. Some of the most prominent Dharma Shastra texts are Manusmriti, written around 200 BC, Yajnavalkya Smriti, Narada Smriti, Vishnu Smriti, Brihaspati Smriti, Katyayana Smriti. These texts were often used for legal judgments and opinion. It is not clear if single or multiple authors wrote these texts. They differ in format and structure from the Dharma Shastras and are written in the verse form. Justice Rama Joyce states that village assemblies exercised judicial functions and decided disputes. The Law Commission also records that whenever and wherever and so far as circumstances permitted, attempts were all along being made in Hindu India to administer justice broadly on the lines indicated in the law books. There was an elaborate system of administration of justice and provisions were made for the description of the highest court to be located at the capital city and lower courts and people's courts at different places. There was also a clear division between civil and criminal cases. In criminal cases, the king alone took the decision while the trial was conducted by others. The variety of courts are noted as Kula, gatherings or family councils, Shreni, which were corporation, Gana, that was an assembly, Adhikriti, that is court appointed by the king, and Nripa, which is the king himself. Muslim law, which was also in vogue in India, applied to both civil and criminal matters. The system was based on the writings of Muslim jurists and practices of Islamic countries. In many instances, Muslim rulers did not interfere with civil matters and the Hindu institutions were allowed to continue. In cases where the dispute was between a Hindu and a Muslim, Muslim law would prevail. In criminal matters, Muslim law would prevail subject to certain exceptions. Galanter has observed that the Mughals and other Muslim rulers had in cities and administrative centers royal courts which exercised a general criminal jurisdiction called the Nizamat and commercial jurisdiction, and also decided collection of revenue and civil matters, also known as Diwani. Apart from revenue matters, civil matters were left to the administration of religious groups, and only if the Muslim population was involved did it reach the court. These courts operated on the basis of Muslim law, which was composed of the Sharia as qualified by custom and royal decree. He also observes, thus these courts were marked by corruption, unprofessionalism, and which allowed a wide discretion in the application of the law. While a hierarchy of courts existed, the activity of the lower courts was not sufficiently supervised. Hindu law was applied by a separate set of courts. These courts set up by the government did not extend deep into the countryside, and the administration of these villages was not controlled by the government courts, but by village courts. The British era under the Company. From 1600 onwards, there was a charter rule. Rohit Day states that modern constitutionalism in India began with the written text of the Charter of 1600 granted by Queen Elizabeth, which delegated both legislative and judicial powers to the governor appointed by the English East India Company for the better advancement and continuance of trade. The sources of law were several: parliamentary charters, acts, Hindu law, Muslim law, English common law and customary law. In relation to matters regarding family, Hindus and Muslims were to be governed by their personal law, and in all other cases which did not fall within any act, by the general principles of equity, justice and good conscience. Between 1772 and 1864, the Dharmashastra texts were compiled and translated by various British administrative scholars such as William Jones, Henry Thomas Colebrook and others. This period also saw Hindu Pandits serving in the administration of justice in British courts. The Regulation Act 4 of 1793 allowed for Hindu and Muslim law to be applied in all matters regarding succession, inheritance, marriage and all civil matters. The Supreme Court was established by the Regulating Act 1773 to provide, in Edmund Burke's words, a strong and solid security for natives against the wrongs and oppressions of British residents in Bengal. The British East India Company had established its own system of courts headed by Sadar Adalats with jurisdiction over the entire province. These courts were under the direct authority of the Governor General's Council and functioned as an arm of the executive rather than as an independent body. The Supreme Court was established to extend to all persons and were directly appointed by the English Crown and not by the Company. The court had power to prosecute offences committed by officials of the government and to ensure that the government exercised its powers in conformity with the laws of England. Mithi Mukherjee argues that this laid the basis for an activist judiciary that was by its own constitution suspicious and hostile to East India Company's legislative and administrative authority. It entertained suits brought by the natives against members of the provincial councils and other members of the bodies of the East India Company. In the famous Patna case, Nadara Begum instituted an action of trespass in the Supreme Court against the judges of the Patna Provincial Council for forcibly entering her house and assaulting her servants and damaging her property while enforcing a decree against her. The first Law Commission was constituted in 1834 under the chairmanship of T.B. Macaulay to look into the constitution of courts and the nature of laws. It was believed that there were different systems of law which were being administered in various parts of British India, and these systems widely differed from each other but coexisted and were co-equal. The codification of law began after the establishment of this commission. The Draft Penal Code of 1837 was one of its main achievements. The Second Law Commission was asked to examine the possibility of a single system of pleadings and practice that would be uniform in all the courts of presidency. Thus, the first Penal Code, the Civil Procedure Code, the Criminal Procedure Code were enacted following the recommendations of the Commission. The Commission was of the opinion that what India needed was a body of substantive civil law that would be modelled upon English law of the time, but would keep in mind the condition, character and institutions of India. British India post the taking over of the administration from the East India Company 1858 to 1950. Following the violent uprising against the British in 1857, which saw almost every symbol of British rule attacked, the Royal Proclamation of 1858 was announced and the colonial government of India was transferred to the British Crown. This also marked the end of the hallowed Mughal Empire with the exile of the last Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. The Government of India Act 1858 authorized the taking over of the administration of all territories from the East India Company. 1860 saw an extensive codification of law. The sources of law began to be fixed and legislation, as against custom, became the primary source of law. Commercial, criminal, procedural law became fixed and only personal law remained religious law. The Indian High Courts Act established high courts in India in 1861. These abolished the Supreme Courts, which were established earlier by the Regulating Act 1773. The Penal Code, the Code of Civil Procedure, Criminal Procedure were also enacted to bring about greater uniformity in the administration of justice. The Privy Council was the highest appellate body and appeals were heard from the courts established in India as also the various colonies of Ceylon and others. After India attained independence, the jurisdiction of the Privy Council was abolished. Section 200 of the Government of India Act 1935 created the Federal Court at New Delhi, which later continued as the Supreme Court of India. Rohit Dey, in his analysis of constitutional antecedents of the Indian Constitution, quotes Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is reported to have told his students, "The Constitution of British India is contained in an enactment called the Government of India Act 1919. A student of the Constitution of India, therefore, has not to search for the Constitution as the student of English Constitution has to do. His position is very much like the position of the student of American Constitution, whose problem is nothing more than to understand and to interpret the statute embodying the Constitution of the United States." The Government of India Act 1919 repealed over 47 acts going back to 1771 to consolidate the law relating to the government of the country. The object of this act was to promote responsible government in India. It introduced a system of diarchy which divided areas of functioning between a popularly elected assembly and those that were retained by the executive. But importantly, it did not contain any set of rights of people of India, nor did it have universal adult franchise. This was despite the fact that by 1895, Tilak had drafted a constitution with a Bill of Rights. The act introduced the system of two houses of legislature, that is the Council of States and the Legislative Assembly. It also introduced the system of civil service in India and Public Service Commission. It also provided for the manner of its amendment. Government of India Act 1935 removed the diarchy system and established the foundations of a federal form of government. The Government of India Act 1935 provided for a federal court that would have jurisdiction not only over the interpretation of the Constitution, but also over the interpretation of any laws enacted by the federal legislatures. The court also had appellate jurisdiction over civil and criminal cases, which were certified by the High Court as involving a substantial question of law. The Act provided for the appointment of judges by the King on the recommendations of the Secretary of State for India in order to immunize the courts from local politics. Although the 1919 Act and the 1935 Act were passed by the Parliament of Britain and were authoritative texts of the precursors of the Indian Constitution 1950, There were other draft constitutions which also played a key role in the shaping of the Indian constitution. Starting from the 1895 constitution, there was a Commonwealth of India Bill 1925, Gandhian Constitution for a Free India in 1945 and a draft constitution of the Republic of India 1948. In addition to this, the Motilal Nehru report of 1928, the Declaration of Purna Swaraj in 1930, States and Minorities report of Dr. Ambedkar and the Sapru Committee report in 1945 are important historical documents preceding the Indian Constitution. The Constituent Assembly debate reflect the spirit of constitutionalism that marked the Indian nationalist movement. The institution of the Supreme Court and the long engagement with institutions, procedures and the non-violent assertion of Swaraj culminated in the Constituent Assembly debates that saw an animated participation from all sections of society and political parties of all ideologies. As Pratap Bhanu Mehta notes, the Indian nationalist movement, while radical in its normative hopes, was self-consciously a constitutional movement. In its earlier phases, it spoke the language of English law. Even when it acquired under Gandhi the character of a mass movement, it was anti-revolutionary. It placed a premium on eschewing violence as a means of overturning social order or achieving political goals. India has been subject to occasional violent political movements from various secessionist movements to Maoism. But violent revolutionary movements have found it difficult to gain mainstream legitimacy. In that sense, even if not expressed in the formal language of law, a grammar of constitutionalism has marked India's mainstream political choices. Although the idea of non-violence has been associated with Gandhi's legacy, its greatest political practitioners have been India's most marginalized groups, Dalits, who were India's most unimaginably oppressed social groups, with most reason to resent the structural violence of India's inherited social and political order, have in a sense been at the forefront of owning a constitutional culture. In conclusion, we have noticed the origins of the Indian legal system from its ancient moorings to its evolution into a modern legal system. We have discussed the various historical, political influences which have led to the creation of the current legal and judicial system. We have observed that the concept of justice, both as dharma and nyaya, have played a key role in the maintenance of the Indian public order by ancient rulers and the modern state. The key role played by the judiciary as an independent arbiter of disputes and as a check on arbitrary power has also been highlighted. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson. We will meet again for the next lesson. Thank you.